Revisiting some of the presentations I've given in Australia over the last 5 years, I began to see a pattern emerging with ideas that I'd shared, some that I still vociferously believe in, and others that I've begun to question. Each of my papers emphasise the unequal nature of societies and suggests that the arts in all their guises offer people who are marginalised the opportunity to have a voice and make changes in their lives. This is particularly the case in mental health and well-being across the life course. However, in Port Macquarie, thinking about popular culture, I suggested that perhaps we could adapt some of the methods and mindsets of marketing to affect behaviour change. Today I want to question that thinking and, alongside the constant call for robust evidence in arts and health, expand on some of our conversations about the highs and lows of human experience and how they're increasingly being medicalised. At the start of my presentation in Melbourne, I shared Symposium in Blues, an album of songs produced by the pharmaceutical giant Merck, distributed to tens of thousands of general practitioners in the USA in 1966 as a sophisticated marketing campaign for the new antidepressant Elavil. That an album of predominantly black musicians was being used to sell an antidepressant was an ironic and cynical piece of marketing, considering that African Americans accounted for startlingly high numbers of patients incarcerated in mental health units and prisons across the US. At the same time, the largest epidemiological study of mental illness ever conducted in the US, the National Institute of Mental Health's Epidemiological Catchment Area Study, evidenced the striking racial differences in anxiety disorders. So, with inequalities in mind and with much of our lives mediated by marketing, I want to think about evidence in arts and health and ask just what is the evidence we're after, who's it for, and who controls it. Austin Bradford Hill was the statistician on the Medical Research Council's streptomycin and tuberculosis trials in 1948, and their study is generally accepted as the first randomised controlled clinical trial. GP and author Ben Goldacre, in his book Bad Pharma, mischievously reminds us, however, that the first recorded control trial was in fact reported in the apocalyptic Old Testament book of Daniel. Daniel rejects the royal food and wine of the invading king Nebuchadnezzar. Preferring not to eat with noblemen but with the servants, he suggested that the court officials test your servants for 10 days, give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you find. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than those who ate the royal food. So the nobleman's fine food and fine wine is taken away, and they're given the Old Testament version of 5 a day. For a religious parable, this is a million miles away from blazing bushes and parting seas and miracle cures. This ancient story offers us a simple account that the proof of the pudding, quite literally, is in the eating. For centuries, organised religion has controlled the way we see the world, and it seems alongside science we've created a Tweedledee and Tweedledum in the way we understand what it is to be human. I'd argue that what we consider to be authentic and true is so deeply influenced by the pull of science and religion that it often blinds us to what's peddled as the truth in the name of a higher power. That higher power might be supernatural, it might be scientific, but in both cases it's sophisticatedly marketed, making it near impossible for us to separate fiction from non-fiction. As early as 500 BC, Pythagoras was accepting or rejecting his students based on how gifted they looked. Aristotle wrote that large-headed people were mean, those with small faces were steadfast, broad faces reflected stupidity, and round faces signalled courage. This very classical notion of physiognomy and assessing character and morality from outer appearance would now be described as pseudoscience. But for centuries, as scientists searched for tangible external clues to internal temperaments, appearance has been studied forensically. Although the term physiognomy no longer resonates, the assumption of physical appearance as a moral indicator lives on. Though our consumer-driven world has increasingly substituted clothing and material possessions as signifiers of character, we continue to label our fellow humans, and in the UK at least, your skin colour or the trappings of your faith can still get you stopped on the street for looking suspicious. Physiognomy is ugly and often racist, but perhaps we can understand its roots, this urge to classify and make sense of the world. In its time and place, it seemed to be at the cutting edge of thinking, but the dangers of superficial classification were perhaps most manifest in the once esteemed Darwin-inspired disciplines of eugenics. I wonder how a modern-day physiognomist would cope with a dysfunctional, body dysmorphic or re-augmented human hell-bent on life eternal and 24/7 well-being. The answer might not lie in our face, but be more centred on the interior landscape. If you're gay and live in certain parts of Africa, you can be executed. If you're slightly lucky, you might receive a whole life sentence. And if you're a gay Russian citizen, you're most certainly treading on very thin ice. And whilst being gay was judged as a moral sin in biblical terms, and still is in many countries, it was inevitably only a matter of time until science chose to classify homosexuality as a mental disorder, treatable by medication and aversion therapy. And it was only last year that Dr. Robert Spritzer, architect of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, apologised for advocating research that suggested gay people could successfully become straight simply if they were motivated to do so. The American Psychiatric Association released its 5th edition of the DSM this year, which informs the way psychiatrists prescribe drugs and classifies those rich differences in our interior landscape. It comes with 15 new diagnoses and suggestions for many more. You can almost think of them as the kind of things you'd want to change at New Year as a New Year's resolution. If you eat too much, it can become binge eating disorder. If your house is too messy, you could have hoarding disorder. If you check your emails or Twitter or Facebook too often, you might have internet addiction. Former chair of the DSM task force, Dr. Alan Francis, said he believes in the power of psychiatric treatment, but he's concerned that drug companies take marketing advantage of the loose DSM definitions by promoting the misleading idea that everyday life problems are actually undiagnosed psychiatric illnesses caused by chemical imbalance and requiring a solution in pill form. Our new technological obsession with all things neuroscientific might be tempered by the sheer complexity of reducing the centre of who we believe we are to luminous synapses, intricate networks, and pulsing dendrites. In fact, lessons on authenticity might best be learned from earlier lessons in neurology. Following Lenin's death, his brain was of interest to the scientific community and subsequently chopped into 31,000 pieces, with researchers concluding that it showed an extraordinary degree of organisation when compared to an ordinary brain. Similarly, researchers measured Albert Einstein when thinking about relativity and then at rest in order to compare the patterns. The subsequent chart was visual proof increasing brain activity is evidence at the point where scientific thinking occurs. There are 85 billion neurons in the average 3-pound internal supercomputer. Typically, each neuron forms 10,000 connections through synapses and other nerve cells. Researcher Jeff Lichtman's laboratory at Harvard University has an automated tape-collecting lathe ultramicrotome which over 6 days transforms a 1mm thick slice of brain into around 30,000 slices. He estimates there are between 100 trillion and 1,000 trillion connections between neurons, and he's calculated how long it might take to image every slice of a 1 centimetre mouse brain. The answer is a staggering 7,000 years. This is big data indeed, and perhaps if we were to compare our humble brain's capacity for memory to the icons of big data, we can begin to understand its complexity. Over the month of April 2009, Facebook processed a total of 60 billion user images worth 1.5 petabytes of storage. A petabyte's equivalent to over 1 million gigabytes. Now, it's estimated the human brain's ability to store memories is equivalent to 2.5 petabytes of data. That's over 2.5 million gigabytes. That means an individual, healthy human brain contains memories greater than Facebook's entire photographic storage capabilities for April 2009. Big data represent big public interest and potentially big sales. The global marketing consulting firm McKinsey & Company described the potential reach of big data in the pharmaceutical industry. Of course, they described this in monetary terms, estimating that applying big data strategies to better inform decision making could generate up to $100 billion in value annually across the US healthcare system. They suggest that we imagine a future where patients are identified to enrol in clinical trials based on social media rather than doctors' visits. Criteria for including patients in a trial could take significantly more factors into account, like genetic information, to target specific populations, thereby enabling trials that are smaller, shorter, less expensive, and more powerful. But imagine this big data in the hands of people with vested commercial interests, or even worse, those who have the power to manipulate who we are. As healthcare reform stands to be President Obama's crowning glory, or his downfall, the failure of computing systems to handle his country's data could derail the whole process. And with global revelations of the hacked mobile phones of presidents and politicians, it's clear that whoever controls the data, whether it's rogue and out-of-control ex-employees like Edward Snowden, or multinational corporations who are driven by the highest possible ethical standards, we should be concerned about just who holds our data. This movement that we're part of, this arts and health agenda, is growing exponentially, and as a consequence, it attracts not only those of us actively involved in the field, but free marketeers with their eye on either making a quick buck or perhaps patenting a toolkit or a magical framework where all the nuance and complexity of culture and the arts can be packaged into a small, instrumental, do-it-yourself kit, a one-size-fits-all panacea that can be branded and sold on. I expressed a little concern on my blog recently, particularly at one dull-eyed pseudo-economist's assertion that the only way we can prove our efficacy is through robust, randomised controlled trials, the RCT, insisting specifically that we should look at the pharmaceutical industry as best practice. Over the same period, I was thrilled to be asked to give an opening presentation to the first UK Arts, Health and Wellbeing Research Network, at which I made a glib passing reference to the pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, mentioning that in terms of clinical trials, they'd been found guilty of promoting drugs for unapproved uses and failing to report safety data to the Food and Drugs Administration, and fined $3 billion, the largest healthcare fraud settlement in US history. I couldn't understand it when the room fell silent. It emerged that the Chief Executive Officer of GSK was, in fact, the newly appointed Chancellor of the University of Nottingham, the very place where I was speaking, and the host of the UK Arts, Health and Wellbeing Network. Moreover, GSK had just struck a $12 million collaboration with the university. I felt hot and bothered, deeply bothered. In the case of GSK, it's difficult to know where to begin, but I was certainly aware of their partnership with the King's Fund in the UK through their annual GSK Impacts Awards, which see arts and health organisations scrabbling around to get their seal of approval and a big bag of cash. And the fraud case I've referred to includes the promotion of antidepressants for unapproved usage, including treatment of children and adolescents until a ban in 2003 over concerns it triggered suicides. One expert witness claimed the diabetic drug Avandia cause an extra 1,000 heart attacks in the UK every year, and it's now being withdrawn. The US government claims that GSK tried to conceal the dangers of drugs from watchdogs and found them guilty of paying bribes to doctors. The US attorney, Carmen Ortiz, comments, "The sales force bribed physicians to prescribe GSK products using every imaginable form of high-priced entertainment, from Hawaiian vacations, paying doctors millions of dollars to go on speaking tours, to tickets to Madonna concerts." And GSK's catalogue of dodgy dealings is continuing under the spotlight in China, where a bribery investigation is underway alleging they've orchestrated payments said to total £321 million, offering amongst other things prostitutes to doctors to persuade them to prescribe its medicines. One of the arrested GSK executives, Hong Liang, told Chinese state TV that bribes paid to doctors and officials pushed up the prices to Chinese patients and what they pay for GSK drugs by as much as 30%. Goldacre suggests this kind of fraud and deception isn't limited to GSK. Far from it. It's endemic across the pharmaceutical industry, with 66% of fraud cases in the US involving them. He asserts the pharmaceutical industry spends around twice as much on marketing and promotion as it does on research development, much of it paid to high-esteem academic writers for pharmaceutically driven scientific journals. Explicitly, Goldacre argues, for transparency in the reporting of negative data. Only last week, Johnson & Johnson agreed to pay $2.2 billion settlement for allegedly marketing its antipsychotic Risperdal to people with dementia and children when it was only approved by regulators for the treatment of schizophrenia. The payment also covers alleged payments to doctors and pharmacists for their help in promoting it. And like GSK's funding for the Impact Awards in the UK, Johnson & Johnson's been working with the Global Alliance for Arts and Health since 2001. Perhaps it's time for us to re-evaluate our relationships with Big Pharma. In the shower of negative publicity, Goldacre reports on his blog that GSK have recently signed up to the All Trials campaign, which seeks to make all trials, all clinical studies and all summary reports be publicly registered. This is a positive move, but it would be naive to imagine that a profits-driven industry would ever be motivated by public good and philanthropy. At the moment in the UK, even the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, who are charged by the government to make judgments on clinical effectiveness of treatments based on evidence, have no access and no legal right to any withheld clinical data. So what of our dear old arts and health movement in all of this? Thomas Carlyle described economics as the dismal science, and a narrow focus solely on saving the health sector money neglects to embrace the true nature of cultural value in society. Health and well-being are best promoted and protected in the very communities we live and breathe in, not necessarily the places we go to when we're sick. And for a twisted understanding of the fiscal value of the arts, we could perhaps look to the spiralling prison population in the US, where the government have developed a simple algorithm to calculate how many new prison cells they're going to need in 15 years' time. Find out what percentage of children aged 10 to 11 can read today. In fact, female literacy is a significant determinant of health, and Secretary General of the UN Ban Ki-moon has stressed the transformative effect on both family and the wider community when a woman is literate. He comments, by acquiring literacy, women become more economically self-reliant, more actively engage in their country's social, political and cultural life, and all evidence shows that investment in literacy for women yields high developmental dividends. The author Neil Gaiman argues that reading of any sort at an early age is almost a gateway drug to reading through life. You want to know what happens next, particularly with fiction. It builds curiosity and critically empathy, allowing the reader to build scenarios and new possibilities by looking out through other people's eyes. When Albert Einstein was famously asked how we could make our children more intelligent, he replied, by reading them fairy tales. And when asked how we could make them even more intelligent, he said by reading even more fairy tales. He understood the value of reading and, critically, imagination. Again, Gaiman reminds us, it's easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that we're in a world in which society is huge and the individual is less than nothing, an atom in a wall, a grain of rice in a rice field. But the truth is, individuals can change their world over and over. Individuals make the future, and they do it by imagining that things can be different. And boy, do we need to change the system. The UK has witnessed the exposure of abuse and social care, evidenced most harrowingly in systemic neglect within the NHS. And only last week, falsified records for NHS cancer patients have emerged, all in the name of targets. An investigation by Robert Francis QC, the Francis Report, identifies the target-obsessed culture that focused on doing the system's business and not that of the patients. An institutional culture which ascribed more weight to positive information about the service and standards and methods for measuring compliance, and didn't focus on the effect of a service on patients. It seems that our obsession with targets within health and social care has blinded us to the very people we should be caring for, and all prevailing management culture that dominates this sector is mirrored in the arts and cultural sector too. How many times must we listen to bureaucrats and politicians repeating their platitudes? We must learn from our mistakes. The artist David Pledger, in his recent excellent paper for Currency House, Re-evaluating the Artists in the New World Order, provides us with compelling critique of the systems that have seen more money put into marketing and management than into artists, with the artists themselves being at the very, very bottom of the food chain. Yet shouldn't the artists be at the heart of public debate, scrutinising, curious and enabling, questioning dominant ideologies and giving voice to the most marginalised? Pledger astutely suggests that managerialism sees itself as the antidote to chaos, irrationality and disorder, but aren't these the essential elements that are central to the arts? The research of Gary Ansel at Nordoff Robbins shares the intimacy of what Goethe described as gentle empiricism, stressing that our research should always strive to save the phenomenon, never reducing or replacing with an explanation that omits human experience and its involvement in any understanding. Research and evaluation potentially confers power to justify big decisions, and Professor of Social Research Methodology Ray Pawson playfully suggests that mainstream science doesn't use RCTs. What proper scientists do is marshal theories and come up with all manner of ingenious empirical tests of those theories, which then go on to refine the original ideas, and then other groups add further tests to develop the explanation. Pawson asserts that interventions are not treatments. Interventions are complex processes introduced into complex environments attempting to deal with complex problems. We're constantly told what constitutes robust evidence, and more often than not the model that is peddled is the RCT. I don't doubt its place at all in science and medicine, but I have grave concerns for our understanding of RCTs when exemplified by profit-driven and dishonest industry. But perhaps the richest example of distorted evidence held up as unequivocal fact is the UK government's moral and fictional justification for invading Iraq, what's now universally known as the dodgy dossier, claimed to draw upon a number of sources including intelligence material. This was all around weapons of mass destruction and was cited by Blair and Bush as highest quality research. In fact, much of the intelligence material was plagiarised verbatim, including typos, from the graduate student Ibrahim al-Marashi, but copied with dangerous amendments to his text, including changing monitoring foreign embassies in Iraq to spying on foreign embassies in Iraq, and changing aiding opposition groups in hostile regimes to supporting terrorist organisations in hostile regimes. From distorted government spin to the falsified claims of Big Pharma and literal biblical claims, what constitutes evidence feels dubious. In terms of GDP, philosopher Vandana Shiva reflects that a living forest does not contribute to growth, but when trees are cut down and sold as timber, we've got growth. Healthy societies and communities don't contribute to growth, but disease creates growth through the sale of patented medicines. This is a distorted understanding of progress. When every aspect of life is commercialised and commodified, living becomes more costly and people become poorer. The challenge for us is to confidently theorise, to explore and synthesise where we believe our potency lies. When navigating contested territories, and in the current financial climate, do we want to be part of what Shiva describes as anti-life economics? In the face of unethical offers from bad sponsors, can we assert ourselves with authenticity and integrity? If researchers in public health and the arts galvanise our imaginations and envisage work beyond the confines of the neatly categorised sick individual, we could truly be a powerful force for social change and justice. Science and the imagination offer us ways of understanding the how of our existence, whilst religion has attempted to foster imagination and the why of our existence through its moral codes and parables. But increasingly political movements at the extreme right, in the context of globalisation, manipulate religion in order to achieve political aims, and it seems that justifications of fundamentalisms are harder to stomach, the why of existence becoming more confused than insightful. Perhaps then, creativity, culture and the arts offer us the why, offer us ways of making sense of the world and arming ourselves with new possibilities to make change. There's inevitably something of a punk sensibility to the arts, from Pussy Riot bravely and explicitly confronting the state, to this year's 12th Youth Performing Arts Festival in Lahore, Pakistan, that despite being bombed in 2008 continues to encourage girls to take part in contemporary theatre and have a voice. Malala Yousafzai's own story of being shot in the head for promoting girls' education typifies this. Arguably, science and religion compete for our awe and wonder, using the arts to simplify and market their stories, but culture and the arts are more than slavish tools to fulfil others' agendas. And whilst the organic matter of our brains might offer up tantalising glimpses of how the essence of human can be nurtured, enhanced and manipulated, the true complexity of what we are and how we engage with each other and our environment is far more nuanced. Our civic unrest, our discontent at abuses across society may just be a good thing, because discontented and angry people can affect systemic social change. The arts have the power to change mindsets and challenge outrageous inequalities, and just how we evidence this reach might best be understood through the very practice itself.